Civil asset forfeiture is a tool that has exploded over the years. It started off with only 4 programs being able to utilize it, now over 400. We have seen since in history how it's gone from the 60s with the RICO statutes exploded to now to drugs and also to terrorism. Senate Bill 838, which is my legislation, it will try to establish a framework that innocent people don't get caught up in law enforcement and to where that they have to prove to the government where their property is innocent. I'd like to address basically the 4 prongs of my bill, and then we will go on to some other things. The first part of the bill is we would change the law to where the government has to prove guilt before they can permanently keep the property, so that it establishes once and for all that you're innocent till proven guilty. Second, the government has to tie it specifically to a crime. Third, innocent people can get their information or get their property back quickly and in a prompt manner. And then the fourth, I want to create a TSED or a unclaimed style property that is a neutral account that has both citizen oversight as well as law enforcement as well as judicial, so that we don't have an instance to where we have a appearance of impropriety, to where a government agency is just keep growing their own budget. We have examples in Oklahoma. We have, as you see on the placard here, a tip line for people, and we have that today because the basic economics of civil asset forfeiture is, as we've seen in media reports, that the average forfeiture is around $1,200 to $1,000. If that's the case, we see that hiring an attorney is going to cost about $3,000 to $5,000. So on normal circumstances, a person that has their property taken that's less than what it would cost to get back from an attorney, we were making sure that these people have an outlet to where we can get them to where they can contact us so that we can track up their instances. History has shown that we as a country and as a state from time to time have unjust laws. We have had Jim Crow laws, women not having able to vote. We've had plenty of laws that were just flawed. And this law, civil asset forfeiture, is, I believe, one. I'm trying to make it to where law enforcement has the tools that they need to go after the drug cartels, but yet innocent people's property is not taken. We all agree that law enforcement has a tough job, and we don't want to do anything to hinder that. However, we have come up through history, the Miranda rights and other constitutional protections for innocent people. And I believe that that's what the vein that we need to work on today. My bill will do nothing in preventing law enforcement for seizing what they believe is evidence of a crime or part of a criminal activity. My impetus is, as a small business owner, is to help the mom and pop out there that deal in cash. And we've seen through studies and other things that the average Oklahoman, not the average Oklahoman, but there is a good segment of the population that don't use the traditional banks. They use cash only. Well, I don't believe that they need to be penalized just because they're dealing in cash. On top of the tip line, we're here also to announce the results of a statewide survey that was commissioned by 2 think tanks that very rarely work together, OK Policy and Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs. And we're also joined by the ACLU. We also have a written statement from OK2A, a Second Amendment guns organization, that has voiced their support of this legislation as well. But to go on to talk about the actual results of the polling, Bill Shepard, who's the CEO of Shepard Research, is here to discuss the findings of the poll. Sooner Poll has been recognized as one of the state's most accurate polling firms, and the support of civil asset forfeiture is growing all across the state. So without any further ado, Bill, get into the results, please.
Thanks, Senator. First of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about this poll. This poll was conducted among 403 likely Oklahoma voters. That's very significant, not among registered voters. These people show up for elections as part of the electorate that we talked to. It's a probability sample. It was done in a scientific way. It has a 95% confidence level. What is also important is that you'll find in these packets that we also released a call disposition report and a rate calculation report and a weighting table report. These types of reports, this type of disclosure is the highest level of transparency, and I'm the only independent, nonpartisan polling firm in the state, but the only polling firm to also release that type of information about the process, about how the poll was conducted. So that being said, let's look at the results of what we found. the significance is when we asked, do you support or oppose new legislation that would allow law enforcement only to keep confiscated property when a criminal conviction is achieved? And as you can see, 70% supported new legislation. The support was seen both among liberals and conservatives. Again, another key part of the reason why these two sides of the ideological spectrum have come together for this particular issue. That included 53% of Democrats, half of independents, and 58% of Republicans. Now, to show the significance of liberals, moderates, and conservatives being in support of this, as you can see, total support among very liberal, those that identify themselves as very liberal, 59%, all the way to 72% of those that consider themselves to be very conservative. I think another part of this debate, and one of the things that we wanted to capture, was asking them about getting, if they can keep confiscated property without getting a conviction, that it would deny those of their constitutional rights of due process and as American. And this one was very, very high. 63% strongly agreed. It's very rare that we see any issue like that in Oklahoma that has those many people identifying with the highest Likert scale option, which is, in this particular case, strongly agree. Then we also asked, not being able to get without a conviction would greatly hamper the ability of law enforcement to effectively fight the war on drugs and drug cartels that ship drugs, and that should be money, not months, but money across the nation. And so this has a lot of the arguments that are put forth by law enforcement and district attorneys within, that it would greatly hamper their ability. And as you can see, Oklahomans, likely voting Oklahomans, do not believe that merely by taking away somebody's Cadillac because of suspicion of some sort of drug activity, that somehow that's going to hamper their ability in which to fight the war on drugs. Okay? And then lastly, we wanted to make sure that we showed, because this is a very, very significant part, these same people that had these very strong views on civil forfeiture also think very highly of their law enforcement agencies. We asked, do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of your local police or sheriff's department? And as you can see, 55% of voters had a very favorable, another 27% had a somewhat favorable. So it's rather significant. 81% of the same people in this poll love, I guess you could use that word probably, highly favor their law enforcement agencies, and yet at the same time, when we see that they do not support the law enforcement behind civil forfeiture, that basically I think the public is saying that law enforcement and district attorneys are on the wrong side of this issue. Not that they don't like them, but they just think they're on the wrong side of this issue. So, Senator?
Our next speaker, we're going to have David Blatt from OK Policy.
Thank you very much. My name is David Blatt. I'm Executive Director of Oklahoma Policy Institute. We are a Tulsa-based think tank. We work on policies to provide for fair and adequate funding of public services and expanded opportunity for all Oklahomans, and very much appreciate the opportunity to be here today and speak out for the need for civil asset forfeiture reform. We give our police and district attorneys a lot of power to do a hard job, but they are still human beings who can make mistakes, and we need safeguards to avoid creating bad incentives for policing practices. From the standpoint of our organization, civil asset forfeiture is especially an issue that affects low-income Oklahomans and racial and ethnic minorities. As you know, we're dealing with situations where people will get pulled over and have, in many cases, cash that they will be carrying with them in their car or on their person taken away from them. And I think many people ask, why would you be driving around with $1,000 in cash or $5,000 in cash or even $10,000 in cash on your person? Well, for a large percentage of low-income folks and ethnic and racial minorities, the reason is they don't have a bank account. If you look at data that has been put out by the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Commission, they do a study every 2 years. 8% of all U.S. residents, households, don't have a bank account. In Oklahoma, that's about 11%. Among minorities, those numbers can be 2 or 3 or 4 times as high. So 20% of African American households nationally don't have a bank account. In Oklahoma, that's about 33%. Among Latino households, about 18% nationally don't have a bank account. In Oklahoma, that's as high as 38%. It's also particularly prevalent among young households. So the populations that are most likely to be stopped by the police are also most likely to have cash on their possession. We know that most forfeitures are for $1,000, $1,200 or less, as Senator Lovelace mentioned. If you're low income, there is no way that you can afford the expense of an attorney to try to recover $1,000 or $2,500. So this becomes another predatory practice that traps economically vulnerable people in poverty. So along with other organizations in this broad coalition, we call upon the legislature to enact sensible reforms. We see, based on this poll that is released today, that there is popular support for putting an end to abusive practices and creating reasonable, constitutionally solid safeguards. Thank you.
Next, we're going to have Trent England with the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you all for being here. I am proud to, and I'm Trent England with the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs, as the Senator said. I'm proud to live in a state where people so strongly support law enforcement, as the Sooner poll results show. And at the same time, to live in a state where, as one of the earlier charts showed, people so zealously, so steadfastly stand up for their constitutional rights. And Senator Lovelace began with a reference to James Madison, one of the primary authors not only of the Constitution but of the Bill of Rights. The American founders saw no contradiction between law and order and checks and balances on the people we ask to provide that law and order, on the police, on prosecutors, on judges. You go and read the Bill of Rights, and a lot of my friends here are very involved in litigating issues in the First Amendment or the Second Amendment. But you get to the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment, you go through the Bill of Rights, it's all about protections on people who are being investigated, tried, prosecuted, or even punished for criminal activity or criminal accusations. That's all that we're here to talk about, is checks and balances on a system that we know has led to some abuses. We know that there are innocent people who have lost their property, and we know, as David was saying, that a lot of this falls hardest on the people who can least afford it. Very excited also about the tip line and the fact that we're able to make some more efforts to try to find these stories, because frankly, there are a lot of people in our communities who are not very excited about once they do go through this process of civil asset forfeiture, of what they see as picking another fight with law enforcement. So I just encourage people to disseminate the number. If you know of people who have had who have suffered this kind of abuse, the stories that we have talked about. Contact the tip line and share those stories and get some help on the one hand, and also help us build the case for reform, for sensible checks and balances on this process of civil asset forfeiture in Oklahoma. Thank you.
And finally, we're going to have Brady Henderson with the ACLU, and then I'll wrap up with some last comments, and then we'll open up for questions.
Thank you, Senator. I'll try to get this a little closer, if it's on. As the Senator said, my name is Brady Henderson. I'm Legal Director of ACLU of Oklahoma. I spent many years, though, as a prosecutor down in Cleveland County. And I very much appreciate what Trent just said, because I think it's incredibly important that what we're talking about, as much as anything, is checks and balances. The same checks and balances that when I was a prosecutor both frustrated me at times, but also made me better at what I did. The simple requirement that I wasn't just there to go get the bad guys. I was there to serve and seek justice. I was there to do something more. I was there to preserve a tradition of liberty and fairness that goes back to the founders of our country. That's exactly what our law enforcement officers are there to do as well. And from both being a prosecutor and now as a civil rights attorney, I can tell you from both sides I see the same thing. And that is, what law enforcement needs to serve our communities is our trust. And when we don't have checks and balances, when we don't have proper transparency, when we have a system that can turn cops into collections agents, that erodes that trust. It makes it harder for the community and the people who protect it to come together as one. And that is a potential tragedy in the making. It's a problem that I think any of us can understand. It's also a problem that's very easy to solve, and that's why we're here today. It's not a matter of ending a system. It's a matter of making it work better. And that's something that's in the best tradition of law and policy all through our history. You see, it's really pretty simple. It's like the side of the police cruiser says, to protect and serve, not to forfeit and seize. And yet what we are seeing is dedicated law enforcement units out there that aren't there to respond to crime and that aren't there to prevent crime. They're there to go after stuff, money, property. That is what is eroding our trust. And our system, for those innocent victims that are out there, guarantees something that is absolutely horrible and disturbing. It guarantees that if I'm a victim of civil asset forfeiture, if I am innocent, and the state files a forfeiture case, I will not be whole, as we lawyers say. I will lose time or I will lose money, because even if I win, I have no way to get back my attorney's fees or my costs in the case or my time in the case. That is something that needs remedied, and it needs remedied badly. And it can be remedied very easily without cutting into any powers that law enforcement need to keep us safe. That's why we're here today. And it's why it is incredibly important to consider legislation like this, to consider the simple idea of reform when we have a system that is set up with the deck stacked against citizens, that is set up in a way that it actually hampers our ability to protect and serve and the ability of our law enforcement to do it. To me, it comes to no surprise when looking at the results of the poll that Soonerpoll recently conducted, because what it tells me is what I already know, that here in Oklahoma we value freedom, we value public safety, we value justice, we value fairness, and that is exactly what is reflected here. What is reflected here is an overwhelming majority of Oklahomans who understand that law enforcement, when done properly, is there to keep us safe and build strong and safe communities, and that part of what we have to do is have laws that serve that purpose, not just treating people as a revenue stream. Thank you so much.
Again, I want to thank you all for coming again. We're going to open up for questions, but it's interesting in that, and I'll leave you with another historical quote that Noah Webster said, that when a man or government, a group of men, hold both the purse and the sword, that day liberty dies. I don't believe that we're there, but I think that we're heading in that direction. And so that's why I filed Senate Bill 838, as well as I will intend to do other legislation as well to curtail this and to put a framework into place. And I am a friend of law enforcement. I've authored legislation in the past to protect law enforcement for when they're attacked off duty. So the argument that some have claimed that this is against law enforcement or that this is part of the war on cops, I don't believe that. I believe that in our Constitution, and I believe that we can coincide, and I don't believe that there's a zero-sum game to liberty. And so with that, I open it for questions.
Who do you want to call the hotline? Someone who has been through the process or feels like they have
Either or. The hotline is for someone that we believe a average or common person that, and just so you know, the hotline is there. It's 866-901-7559. It is for the average person, because if you think about the average forfeiture case, it's around $1,000 to $1,200. Well, if that's the case, the cost of getting an attorney is so much higher. So the average person or low-income person is not going to be able to pursue it. They just say, you know what, I lost my $800, or I lost my $500, or whatever it is. And so, or their vehicle that they impounded was less than what they would receive. So that's who we're looking for.
Are they going to be getting legal advice?
Nope, that we just getting their tip line to see it, get their information, and we're going to try to track down to see if there's cases involved, to see if what forfeiture has been done, and then we'll move forward with that.
They do it anonymously?
If they don't want to leave their name, that's up to them.
So what help will they receive from you?
Basically, I'm trying to change the law. I mean, you know, I'm not offering a free legal advice, and I don't know I'm not going to commit the ACLU to that either. But what we're trying to do is just get the information so that we can show that, because as we've moved through this process from May, a lot of both legislators and people have said, where's the Oklahoma examples? Well, we have cases, and we've shown that are cases. Other media has shown that there are cases. But what we're looking for is a wide issue of that. And I believe that that's what we're going to find.
Senator, as both sides of the issue have kind of said their piece over the last several months, have you seen the public views? Have you seen those change?
Well, first off, when I introduced the bill in May, I have found that most people like myself, there are two types of people. Those that hate civil asset forfeiture because they know about it, and the other people who don't even know about it. And once they do, they don't like it. So that's been part of, since May, my efforts to be loud and vocal and be the person out front, because people need to know that this happens. I don't think the average Oklahoman knows that on your way to Norman or Tulsa or wherever, if you happen to meet the profile of someone that traffics drugs and they think that you smell like marijuana and a drug dog tips them off that you're smelling like drugs, they can seize the property in your vehicle without bringing charges. As we've seen many times, they don't bring charges. So they basically take your property, you go down the road, and 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, you have to petition the government to get your stuff back. And I don't believe that that's American. I don't believe that's constitutional. I don't believe that that's the state of Oklahoma that we want to live in.
Where's the bill assigned?
Well, currently it is in, when I introduced the bill in May, it was assigned to Judiciary. And I have every indication that from the chairman, Sykes, has never had an interim study ever. And so the different interim study that we had in Tulsa, as well as the one here that he moved forward, he's never done that before. So that shows to me that he's willing to and open to the idea of discussing it. If he chooses not to do so, I will use every remedy in my power to go to a different committee. I believe that this is an issue that Oklahomans care about, and I don't believe that that would be a terrible problem.
Do you think you can get it reassigned if Sykes won't hear it?
That or introduce another bill, or introduce. I mean, there's different ways to going around that. Yes.
What did the Senate committee find in Tulsa?
That my bill was bad. No, I shouldn't be lighthearted about it. But basically, law enforcement made the case that this would hamper their abilities to take drug cartels' money. And they showed through hidden compartments in cars and through large sums of money that my bill wouldn't allow them to do that. I disagree, and I don't believe that most would agree that my bill does that as well.
Is there any way to quantify how, and this is maybe where your tip line comes into play, is there any way to quantify the extent of the problem?
And that's part of that's kind of a side issue is you would think if I asked as a state senator, I called Gary Jones' office or some other office and I said, how much has been seized in the last 5 years? You would think I would be able to get that number, but you can't. And that's part of the issue. It's not the specific of my bill. The reporting and what they do with the money is a subsequent tangent issue, but it is something that needs to be addressed, which I will probably try in another bill.
So you're saying Gary Jones is not providing you the information?
No, what I'm saying is, if you just asked anybody how much was seized and how much was forfeited statewide across all the different agencies and all the different law enforcement, it's very difficult to get. ACO, you want to?
Yeah, let me jump in on that because we've been working for a while on coming up with those numbers. And the problem isn't that any one public official isn't wanting to produce something. The problem is there really is no centralized reporting for all this. So nobody really knows the figure, even if we're only talking about cash. And that's only one kind of property to be seized. And in fact, one of the things I would say to any member of the press, when we have so many people now from places like the Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics, some district attorneys' offices, calling this a transparent system, let's ask them a very simple question. And that's, how much is being seized every year? How much is being forfeited? If it's transparent, we should be able to know that. But the reality is nobody knows that information, at least that we've seen. We've been working for months, and we still don't know that information. We know it's well into the millions, but part of the problem is that counties simply do all this locally in many cases. And then you have agencies like the Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics that file a case in a county court, but the money goes through a state system, a different state system than happens if the Department of Public Safety files it. Or if, for instance, the Highway Patrol does the stop, but then it goes to a drug task force, but then it might go federal. There are all of these different things that happen that are incredibly difficult to understand. And in fact, even as we've tried to figure out how many cases have criminal charges attached to them, one of the things we have found is that in some cases, you will have a state forfeiture and a federal criminal prosecution for completely different things. So essentially, you'll have the feds over here saying you violated some sort of interstate drug law, and Oklahoma saying we're going to take your property away for a violation of a whole different state law. And they'll be going on at the same time, but in two totally different court systems. That's one of the big problems right now, is really nobody has a clear sense of the information. And one of the things, like I said, I challenge anybody to do is go ask these state officials. If this is so transparent, why don't we know the most basic of information about its results?
Any other questions?
Is there any concern, right or wrong, that forfeiture might be so ingrained into law enforcement that removing it might be, detrimental to them?
That is an issue that law enforcement's brought up, is that this would hurt their budgets. And to me, permanently taking someone's property is different than a budget issue. Taking someone's property is a constitutional, unconstitutional, un-American thing to do. If we want to talk budgets, then let's talk budgets. And how do we do budgets? We put it through a committee, and then we vote on it, and then whether it be at the state legislature or county commissioners. But that's not what's happening under civil asset forfeiture. Under civil asset forfeiture, an agency or a county sheriff takes the property, and they get to keep it. Well, that's not right. And the reason is, and the federal government has agreed, because they've started to stop agencies using forfeiture to budget for salaries. Now, I ask you that. Why? Well, the reason is, if they're counting on budgetary reasons coming into a fiscal year, and they take money and they're using it for salaries, that means if they're budgeting for it, that means they have to meet a quota to meet that budget for people's salaries. So the question then becomes, why are we allowing this to happen? And we shouldn't be.
Also, have there been any polls in the state about this topic before now?
I'm sure there have. This is the only one that I know of that's been made public. This is one that was commissioned by both different think tanks that have different philosophies of how state government should run, and I think it's newsworthy because we have both a wide coalition. We have the National NFIB, who has voted its members. So you think about that. The National Federation of Independent Businesses, of small business, they voted on it earlier this year, and 92% of their members said we need to change civil asset forfeiture. And why is that? Because business runs on cash. An OSU economics professor just recently came out and said that in totality, the United States is being hindered by overregulation, use of eminent domain, and civil asset forfeiture. And that economic development has been hurt by that. So you have to think this is not just a constitutional issue, which I believe it to be, but it is also a business issue. Because I'm a small business owner, and I know that there are times when you deal in cash. Any other questions? If not, I imagine if you want an individual interview or something, we can go out in the hall or with any of the people up here. So thanks again for coming.